Alright, so what we're going to do today is we're going to look at duplicating objects, duplicating special, and modifying pivot points so that you can just do a little bit more with the individual primitives that you're working with before or even after you combine them. So the first thing I want to do is I just want to look at pivot points. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make something that's kind of like a door. We're going to say this is a door. Alright, and you notice I'm having to scale it up and then move it to keep the bottom of the door on the ground plane, as I'm calling it. Now I can solve this problem by just moving the pivot point, which is this widget right here in the middle. In order to do that, it's a pretty simple procedure. On my keyboard, I have to hit my insert key. Usually that's going to be housed directly to the right of your backspace key, but on different laptops it's in different places. You might need to search for it. But it's the insert key, and when you hit that, as long as you're already in the move tool, right? So if you're on the move widget, and then you hit the insert key, and then what it'll do is it'll change your move widget a little bit. And what I want to do is I want to move this down to the ground floor. Right, so now that I've moved the pivot point, I can hit the move tool or the scale tool or the rotate tool, and it'll rotate from that point instead of from the center of the object. And that's really useful because now if I wanted to make my door taller, I could. If I wanted to make it shorter, I could really easily from this ground plane. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to be able to open my door like it's on a hinge. So I'm going to come in, I'm going to hit the move tool again, I'm going to hit insert on the keyboard, and I'm just going to zoom in and move my pivot point over to this corner of the door. So I've lined up with that corner, and now if I use the rotate tool, then the door is going to open on that plane. Pretty much like a door is supposed to. So like I said, it's pretty straightforward. It's a simple key press. All you have to do is be in the move tool, which is your hotkey W, or you can come up and select on the move tool right here. And as long as you're in that tool, you just press insert on the keyboard. And that'll allow you to move the pivot point around. And just like the move tool, most of the time you want to focus on just moving it with the actual lines, the red line, the green line, or the blue line, instead of trying to move it with the actual center object pivot, because that's kind of hard to get things into the position that you want. It's a lot easier when you just use kind of the arrows or the lines to move it around. We will look in a minute at some easier ways to kind of modify edges and verts and faces without having to click on these arrows all the time. But that'll be for a minute. The next thing I want to talk about is how to duplicate objects. Similarly to pretty much any software that you're familiar with, you can select an object and you can hit Edit and Copy, which is Control C, and then Edit and Paste, which is Control V. And what that will do is that will give you two objects that are exactly the same. And that's an okay thing to do, but generally in a modeling software like Maya, that's not great, because what this is doing is it's going to copy every single texture that you've created, every material that you've created. So even if these are exactly the same in game and they use the exact same material, Maya is going to create two different materials for them, which pretty much doubles your storage space. So we don't want to do that. What we want to do is just duplicate the object, and we can come up and say Edit and Duplicate, and it does basically the same thing, but one thing I'll show you is your initial shape is called polycube 1. Your copy and pasted shape is called pasted polycube 1. And your second duplicated shape is called p-cube shape 2. All that duplicating does is the same thing as copy and paste, except it's just a lot easier and it helps create a smaller file for Maya to work with. And this will only be really important when we start texturing things, but it's a good practice to be in to make sure that you do edit and duplicate. And you'll see the hotkey is Control D right there. And just make sure you do that anytime you want to duplicate something. The next thing I want to do is show you something cool, which is duplicate special. And I use this a lot for mirroring objects, but there are other ways to use it. The first thing I'm going to do is just come in and I'm going to modify this shape right here. Right, and then I'm going to come to here and I'm going to extrude this out. And then I'll extrude this out. Alright, so what we're doing is making a really primitive, terrible airplane of sorts. Why not? So this is our terrible airplane, but what we want to do is we want this object here, this wing, to be exactly the same on the other side. Now that's going to be really hard to do. We can come in here and we can select this and we can extrude it and we can kind of guess, right, and try and get the shape to be exactly the same. But most of the time, we're not going to be able to get them exactly the same. So this is where duplicate special can come in, plus a couple of other things. But the first thing I want to do is I'm going to select my wing here. And I want to come up to Mesh, and I want to extract this wing. And what that does is before they were a single object, right? But now you can see they're two separate objects, which is really helpful. So what I want to do is I'm going to come into my terrible airplane, and I'm going to insert an edge loop straight down the middle. Edit mesh, insert edge loop. I only want one, and I'm going to put it straight in the middle. So now, if I select my wing here, what I want to do is I just want to duplicate it and flip it over the middle of the object. So the best way to do that is to hit the insert key, and I want to move my pivot point to the center of this object. And this is where I was talking about making it a little bit easier to move the pivot point. I'm going to come up to shading and I'm going to turn wireframe on shaded on. So now I can see my lines. Now I'm guessing, and I can still put it pretty close to the center of the object, but if I hold down the V key on my keyboard, you'll notice that it highlights this button up here, which is the Snap to Vertex tool. If I hold it down and then I click on the line, you'll notice that my pivot point is snapping, and I can't put it anywhere else except for on one of the pivot point, one of the vertices. So I'm just going to hover my mouse over this central vertice right here and then let go. And now my pivot point is directly in the center of my object. So now before I duplicate it, I need to come in and I need to delete this face. The same way as we did it before when we had multiple objects that we were combining, we needed to make sure that the faces where they were connected are deleted. So now we can get to the duplicate special. So all I want to do is come up and say Edit, Duplicate Special, and Options. And the duplicate special options here, what I'm trying to do really is I just want to scale this wing over -1. Right, and you can see here is scale. If I set it to -1, it will be exactly in place where I want it. So under the duplicate special, I want to scale in the X value. So this is X, this is Y, and this is Z. And that's true for translate, rotate, and scale. So I want to scale it in the X. I want to scale it -1. And now if I hit apply, you'll see that I've mirrored the wing over to the other side of the object. And now I can just come in and the same thing as last week. If I come to mesh and combine, and then I can say F9 and come through and edit mesh and merge all of these vertices. And now I have a single object again, but I do need to center its pivot point. So I'm going to hit the insert key on my keyboard and I'm going to move the pivot point back to the center. So now I have a really terrible airplane, but we've demonstrated how to duplicate an object and how to move a pivot point. Some of the other stuff we looked at, the mesh and extract. Select a set of faces and you can extract them and kind of make a separate object, and that's good whenever you want to duplicate something without duplicating the whole object. And we also got a little bit of a taste just looking at the channel box. You'll notice that originally my airplane was completely vertical, and I want it to be horizontal, so I can rotate it and try and guess and get it to be as close to horizontal as I want, or I can come over to the channel box editor and I can actually say rotate -90 degrees, and now that's going to make it exactly flat to the plane. Right? It's really hard to gauge stuff like that, but when you come over here you can be a little bit more mathematical about it. And instead of rotating it, 90.416 like this, I can just type in -90. Or if I wanted it to be vertical, I could type in 0 again. If I typed in 180, he'd be looking down. And if I typed in 270 or 90, then he'll be upside down. And then back to -90 to put him right side up. So there we go. Pretty simple concept for moving the pivot point. Just remember you need to be in the move tool before you hit insert on your keyboard. So that's pretty much all for this lesson. Next lesson we'll look at beveling and filling holes and what your assignment's going to be. As always, if you have any questions, you can email me at acarricker7615@stanley.edu.